I still remember the exact weight of my phone in my hand when the call came through. It was a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because my daughter had called me that morning to remind me about her birthday dinner on Saturday, and I remember thinking I had 4 whole days to find a gift. I was sitting in seat 34B on a flight somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, 38,000 feet above nothing, when the flight attendant announced we were beginning our descent into Tokyo. And then my phone reconnected to the network, and everything changed. There were 11 missed calls, 7 from a number I didn't recognize, 3 from my son-in-law, 1 from a number that made my stomach drop the moment I saw it, the non-emergency line for the police department back home in Tucson, Arizona. I am 63 years old. I have been a civil engineer for 37 years. I have built bridges, literally and figuratively, across 4 decades of a career that required precision, patience, and the ability to stay calm when everything around you is shifting. I am not a man who panics, but sitting in that seat as the wheels of that plane touched down on a runway in Japan, I felt something I had not felt since the morning my father died, a cold, spreading certainty that something had gone very, very wrong. I called my son-in-law first. He didn't answer. I called the unknown number. A woman picked up on the second ring and identified herself as a detective with the Tucson Police Department. She asked me to confirm my full name, my date of birth, and my home address. I gave her all 3. Then she asked me a question I was not prepared for. She asked me where I had been for the past 9 days. I told her I was on a flight. I told her I had just landed in Tokyo. I told her I had been in Singapore for a week on a project consultation, a bridge expansion on the southern end of the island, and that I had paperwork, hotel records, a signed contract, and at least 6 colleagues who could confirm every single day of my whereabouts. I told her I had flown from Singapore to Tokyo and was now waiting to board my connecting flight back to Phoenix. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Calloway, your wife has filed a report stating that you have been following her, entering the family home without permission, and making threatening statements to her in person on at least 4 separate occasions over the past 9 days." I said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then I said, "I'm sorry." "Say that again." She repeated it. Every word. I want to tell you that I handled that moment with the composure of a man who had spent 4 decades learning how things break and how to hold them together. I want to tell you I responded calmly and logically, and that I immediately began presenting my evidence in a clear and organized manner. But the truth is, for about 45 seconds, I just stared at the wall of the terminal at Nard Airport and felt the floor tilt underneath me. My wife's name is Diane. We had been married for 31 years. We have 1 daughter, Rebecca, who is 30 years old and lives 20 minutes from our house. We have 2 grandchildren, a 6-year-old named Oliver and a 4-year-old named June. Diane and I built our life together in a 3-bedroom house in a quiet part of Tucson, surrounded by saguaro cactus and desert light. I coached youth soccer for 12 years. She ran the church bake sale every spring until her knees gave out. We were not a dramatic couple. We were not the kind of people who had stories like this. Or so I had believed. The detective asked if I was available to speak further. I told her I had a 4-hour layover before my connecting flight and that I would go nowhere and do nothing until we had sorted this out. She told me she would call me back within the hour. I found a quiet corner of the terminal, sat down on a bench between a newsstand and a charging station, and started making calls. My son-in-law, Marcus, finally answered on the 3rd try. He sounded exhausted. He told me that Diane had called Rebecca 2 days ago in a state of distress, crying, saying that I had come home unexpectedly, and that I had stood in the hallway of our house and told her she needed to leave by the end of the month. He told me Rebecca had gone over to the house and found Diane shaking. He told me that a neighbor, a man named Carl, who had lived 3 houses down for about 8 years, had apparently told Diane that he had seen my car in the driveway twice in the past week. My car. In my own driveway. I asked Marcus if Rebecca believed any of this. He was quiet for too long before he answered. He said Rebecca didn't know what to think. He said Diane had seemed genuinely frightened. I sat with that for a moment, then I opened my email and forwarded Marcus every piece of documentation I had. My flight itinerary showing departure from Tucson on the 14th, my hotel reservation in Singapore, my signed consulting contract, a photograph my colleague Janet had taken of our team on the first day of the project, all of us standing in front of the bridge model in the conference room, with a date stamp in the corner. I told Marcus to show everything to Rebecca. I told him to have her look at the dates. Then I called my colleague David, who had been on the project with me from day one. David is 58, meticulous, and the kind of man who saves every receipt out of pure habit. I explained the situation in as few words as possible. He was stunned. He told me he would compile whatever I needed. He told me the hotel would have check-in and check-out records, the company would have my badge swipes from the Singapore office building, and that the project manager had photographs and attendance logs from every single meeting. He said he would have a complete file sent to me within 2 hours. The detective called back while I was still on the phone with David. I asked her to give me until I landed in Phoenix to provide her with documentation. She agreed, but she told me the complaint was on record and that it included a formal request for a protective order. I asked her if anyone had actually come to the house to investigate. She said an officer had been dispatched and had spoken with Diane, who had been very composed and very specific in her account. Very specific. I kept coming back to that phrase. Let me tell you something about Diane that I should have paid more attention to over the past 18 months. She had changed. I do not say this as a criticism. People change. Marriages shift. But looking back now, I can trace the shift with an engineer's precision, and the timeline is not flattering to my own awareness. 14 months before all of this, Diane had started going to a new gym. Fine. She had started losing weight, buying new clothes, coming home later on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Fine. She had started keeping her phone face down on the kitchen counter, which she had never done in 30 years of marriage. I noticed it. I told myself it meant nothing. I was traveling more than usual that year. 3 international projects in 11 months, and I told myself that the distance between us was something we would close when my schedule slowed down. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong to wait. 8 months before the Singapore trip, I had come home early from a project in Denver, a 2-day meeting that ended after 1, and found a man's jacket hanging on the hook by our front door. Navy blue. Not mine. Diane was not home. I remember standing in the entryway looking at that jacket for a long time. I remember picking it up, checking the label, putting it back exactly where it was. I never said a word about it, not one word. I am not proud of that. I want you to understand that. I am not proud of the way I let silence become a strategy instead of a conversation. I was afraid of what the conversation would reveal, and I chose the illusion of normalcy over the truth. That choice cost me a great deal. When I landed in Phoenix, I went through customs and then sat in the arrivals hall and opened my laptop. David had sent everything. Hotel check-in records showing my name, room number, and the dates August 14th through the 22nd. My employee badge swipe log from the Singapore office showing me entering and exiting the building every day. Janet's photographs. The project manager's attendance logs. A statement from David himself, written on company letterhead, attesting to my presence every single day of the trip. I also had my own phone records. Every call I had made from Singapore, every text. The timestamps, all 9 or 10 hours ahead of Tucson time, forming an unbroken chain of evidence that placed me on the other side of the planet while someone, or no one, was supposedly terrorizing my wife and our home. I drove straight to the police station. I did not go home first. I did not call ahead. I walked in and asked to speak to the detective who had called me, and I sat across from her at a small table, and I laid out every piece of documentation I had, organized by date. She looked at it for a long time. She asked me questions. I answered all of them. Then she asked me who else had access to my vehicle while I was away. That question hit me somewhere very still and very quiet. I told her I had left my car in the long-term lot at the airport. I told her Diane had a spare key to the car, as she always had, because we had been married for 31 years and there had never been a reason for her not to. The detective made a note. She asked if anyone else had a copy of that key. I said I didn't know. I think we both understood what that meant. The detective told me she was going to need to do some additional follow-up before she could advise me on next steps. She told me the protective order request had not yet been approved by a judge, and that my documentation would be submitted as part of the record. She told me to stay available and to document anything unusual. I thanked her and walked back to my car in the police station lot and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel for a while. I thought about Carl, the neighbor. I thought about him telling Diane he had seen my car in the driveway twice in the past week. Carl was not a liar, as far as I knew. Carl was retired, widowed, a man who spent a lot of time on his front porch. If Carl said he saw my car, he saw a car. A silver 2019 Jeep Grand Cherokee. There were a lot of those in Tucson. Or someone used Diane's spare key to move mine. That thought settled into me like a weight dropped into deep water. Slow, heavy, final. I did not go home that night. I called Rebecca and asked if I could stay with her and Marcus. She said yes immediately, and the relief in her voice told me that she had looked at the documentation I had sent and that something had shifted for her. When I arrived at her house, she hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Then she sat me down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and told me what else she knew. She told me she had suspected for about 6 months that something was wrong with her mother. Not wrong in the way I was thinking, not mentally, not emotionally. Wrong in the way that Diane had started talking about a man from her gym, a man named Patrick. She mentioned him first as a funny story, then as a friend, then less and less, until Rebecca had noticed the name simply stopped coming up entirely, the way a name does when it has become too significant to be casual. She told me she had driven past our house twice in the past week because she was worried about her mother, and that on the second drive-by she had seen a dark blue truck in the driveway that she did not recognize. She had not told me because she hadn't known what to tell me. She had not told the police because she hadn't thought it was her place. I told her it was absolutely her place now. She called the detective the next morning and gave a statement. The detective ran the plates on the blue truck. Rebecca had written down the number and came back with a name. Patrick Drummond, 49 years old, a member of the same gym Diane had joined 14 months earlier. Here is what the investigation eventually established, piece by piece, over the following 3 weeks. Patrick had been spending time at our house during my trips. He had at some point been given a copy of the spare car key, because Diane had it duplicated at a hardware store, which the store confirmed when the detective followed up. Carl, the neighbor, had seen my car in the driveway twice in the past week because Patrick had been driving it, to the grocery store apparently, and to pick up a prescription. The man had been driving my car, sleeping in my house, and eating food out of my refrigerator while I was building bridges on the other side of the world. The stalking complaint was, the detective eventually concluded, a preemptive legal move. If Diane could establish a pattern of harassment before I returned, she could potentially secure a protective order, force me out of the house, and control the terms of a divorce before I had any idea one was coming. It was not, she would later admit to her own attorney, a plan she had fully thought through. She had not accounted for the fact that I was on another continent with a paper trail, so complete it could have been submitted as a master's thesis. I did not file criminal charges against Diane. I want to be clear about that, and I want to be clear about why. Filing charges would have meant a public record, a trial, and a process that would have pulled Rebecca and the grandchildren into something ugly and lasting. Oliver is 6. June is 4. I am not willing to be the reason they grow up with a broken understanding of what their family was. Whatever Diane did, she is still their grandmother. Whatever she became to me in the end, she was their grandmother first. What I did file was a comprehensive divorce petition, supported by the documentation my attorney described as, and I am using his exact words here, about as airtight as I have ever seen. The protective order request was withdrawn before the hearing. Diane's attorney, once presented with the evidence, apparently advised her in no uncertain terms to change her approach. The divorce was finalized 7 months after I sat in that terminal at Narita Airport and felt the world tilt. I received the house, given that Diane had vacated it voluntarily and that her attempt to establish legal grounds for my removal had been thoroughly undermined. I received a fair division of our shared retirement accounts. I received the Jeep, though I sold it not long after, because I did not want to look at it. I moved forward. That is the only phrase I have for it. Not healed. Not recovered. Moved forward. I kept working. I finished the Singapore Bridge project. I took on a smaller job in Colorado that kept me close to home for 8 months, which was what I needed. I went to Rebecca's house for dinner every Sunday. I watched Oliver play soccer in the backyard and felt something I cannot fully describe, something like grief and gratitude existing in the same breath. There are things I would do differently. I would say something about the jacket. I would have the hard conversation earlier when it might have still been a conversation and not a catastrophe. I would travel less and be home more because the distance I told myself was temporary turned out to be the distance that cost me everything. But I also know this. I am 63 years old and I am still standing. I have my work, my daughter, my grandchildren. I have a clarity now that I did not have before, about what I will accept, about what I will not, about the difference between patience and avoidance, and about the fact that silence is not the same thing as peace. When you spend your career learning how structures fail, you start to understand that the failure is almost never the moment the bridge collapses. The failure is the hairline cracked 3 years earlier that nobody stopped to examine. The moment of collapse is just the day it finally becomes visible. I stopped waiting for things to become visible a long time after I should have. I will not make that mistake again. If you are in a situation where something feels wrong and you are choosing silence because the truth seems too large to face, please hear me when I say this. The truth does not get smaller with time, it only gets heavier. And the longer you carry it without setting it down and looking at it clearly, the more it costs you in the end. I did not explode. I did not threaten. I did not become someone I did not recognize. I got on a plane, I landed, I laid out my evidence, and I let the facts speak at the volume they deserved. That is the only kind of strength I know how to recommend.